World War II spawned many dark and violent events in human history, from the deplorable Holocaust of the Jewish population of Europe to the millions of needless deaths of soldiers sent to slaughter over one man's evil ambitions. There are many haunting events burned into the collective memory of humankind from the Second World War. And then there are horrific events from that grim period of time that are occasionally overlooked. The London Blackout, for example, was a well-known defense tactic the British people endured during the terror of German aerial bombardment between September 1939 and April 1945, a period of over 5 years where government-imposed blackout measures were taken to mitigate bombing attacks from the German army. The bombardments of the infamous German Blitz operation over cities and towns across Great Britain culminated in immense destruction and tens of thousands of deaths of the country's civilian population. However, during those frightening days of darkness and assault on the British people, one of their own decided to take advantage of the chaos and uncertainty and indulge in their very own monstrous reign of terror. They would become known by many names, the most infamous being the Blackout Ripper, a true horror in history. Only 54 years prior to the Blitz and the Blackout, London was turned upside down by the notorious serial killer Jack the Ripper, who sadistically murdered and mutilated 5 women on the streets of London. And now, a new serial killer lurked in the shadows, attacking up to 7 women over a 6-day period in February 1942. Over 57 consecutive days of bombing runs by German air forces, all citizens were made to observe a mandatory nightly blackout of London, boarding up windows and any other crack or crevice where light could escape to the outside, and turning off all lit signs and street lamps in order to hide targets from the looming German bombers. And it was the resulting darkness and low visibility conditions that the Blackout Ripper used to their advantage to prey on unsuspecting women going about their evening business. The killer's true identity, it would later be revealed, was that of 28-year-old Gordon Frederick Cummins. The eldest of 4 children, Cummins was born in 1914 in North Yorkshire, England. He received a private education in Wales, earning a degree in chemistry at the age of 16, and went on to attend college, though dropped out in November 1932. From there, Cummins bounced around a number of odd jobs in industrial chemistry and leatherworking, though he was terminated from many of these positions before moving to London in 1934, where he became obsessed with living the life of the aristocracy. Gaining employment in a clothing factory, Cummins would boast to his co-workers of his self-proclaimed noble birth and his very large inherited financial allowance, which enabled him to live a life of luxury and to romance many women in the city. Though why a rich young nobleman who lived a life of luxury would need to work in a clothing factory for £3 a week was anyone's guess. To further solidify his charade, Cummins would often steal and embezzle money to fund his fabricated wealth and was able to craft a convincing Oxfordian accent to fool acquaintances he would often fraternize with in upscale hotels and clubs. Cummins' arrogant behavior eventually caused him to lose his job at the clothing factory, and in 1935 he decided to join the Royal Air Force. Once again, his inflated ego, pretentious nature, and ludicrous claims of nobility wore thin with his fellow servicemen, and Cummins would disparagingly be dubbed the Count and the Duke during his military career. By 1941, Cummins was promoted to the junior rank of leading aircraftman, and in 1942, his exemplary performance on an aviation exam and 1,000 hours of flight experience earned him a station at the Air Crew Receiving Center in Regent's Park, London, where he was to report for duty February 2, 1942, just 6 days before his infamous murder spree was to begin. While the notorious days of the Blackout Ripper occurred primarily in February 1942, Cummins' first suspected murders are thought to have begun the year prior in October 1941. While Cummins was stationed in Wiltshire, he began taking night trips to London. Soon after, on October 14th, the body of 19-year-old Maple Churchyard was found naked in a bombed-out London building by a group of workers. Her purse emptied, but no signs of sexual abuse found, a telltale clue revolving around some of Cummins' future victims. Churchyard was murdered the night before, strangled with her own undergarments, the coroner concluding the murderer to be left-handed due to the bruising on her neck, indicating the perpetrator to have more strength in their left hand over their right. Just 4 days after the murder of Maple Churchyard on October 17th, a mortally wounded 42-year-old woman identified as Edith Eleanor Humphreys was found in her bed inside her residence in Regent's Park. She was discovered with her head and face bludgeoned, her neck bruised from strangulation, her throat cut, and a stab wound in her head that had punctured her brain. She died a short time later at the hospital. There was no evidence of forced entry to her home, as her door was simply ajar, though investigators noted that several pieces of jewelry had been stolen. At the time of Edith's murder, Gordon Cummins had a residency in St. John's Wood, where he would stay while on leave from the RAF. It was less than a mile from Regent's Park, where Edith Humphreys resided. On a cold, wintry Monday morning on February 9, 1942, the body of a 41-year-old pharmacist named Evelyn Hamilton was discovered inside an air raid bomb shelter by an electrician. The previous evening, she was last seen alive by a waitress at the Maison Leon Corner House in Marble Arch celebrating her birthday. Gordon Cummins that same evening had been visiting his wife in Southwark, a few miles from where Evelyn was celebrating. He asked his wife to borrow some money for a night on the town. When Evelyn's body was discovered in the bomb shelter, her clothes were disheveled and her shoes were covered in scuff marks, indicating an intense struggle with her attacker. Her cause of death was determined to be strangulation by someone left-handed. Like previous victims, she was robbed, her handbag missing, which was later recovered on another street, short 80 pounds. And despite her torn and partially removed clothing, Evelyn did not appear to have been sexually assaulted, despite some abrasions around her chest. But then, something changed in Cummins, as was so horrifyingly apparent in his next victim. February 10th, just one day after the discovery of Evelyn Hamilton, 2 meter readers servicing a residence found the naked and mutilated body of 35-year-old Evelyn Oatley. She was laid out upon her bed at her apartment on Waldorf Street in Soho, just 2 miles from Marble Arch where Evelyn Hamilton was murdered. As opposed to the other victims of Cummins' murder spree, investigators were shocked by the state of Oatley's body. Oatley had been beaten, evidenced by the bruising around her mouth and chest. She then appeared to have been strangled to the point of unconsciousness before a savage cut had been made across her throat, severing her arteries, which would have been fatal. However, the grisly details of the murder don't end there. In addition to being beaten, strangled, and having her throat cut, Oatley was slashed multiple times along her abdomen, thighs, and genitals with a safety razor and can opener. She had also been sexually assaulted with a flashlight. No defensive wounds were found on Oatley's hands or fingers. A working prostitute and club hostess, Evelyn Oatley was said by witnesses to have met a young pilot outside of a restaurant late on the evening of her murder. Back at Oatley's apartment building, a neighbor recounted seeing her with a young airman in the stairwell at 11:40 p.m. that night. She was the last person to see Oatley alive. The same neighbor stated that she was suddenly awoken later that night by the considerable volume of Oatley's radio. However, she decided not to go to her neighbor's door to complain. On February 13th, 15-year-old Barbara Lowe was walking down the corridor to her mother's apartment. She was visiting her mother in London from her boarding school, as she often did every third weekend of the month. On her way to her mother's, Barbara was informed by a neighbor that her mother had not been seen for a few days. There was an unclaimed package at her mother's doorstep to corroborate this. 43-year-old Margaret Florence Lowe was discovered in her bed, murdered and, like Evelyn Oatley, sexually mutilated. Only this time, worse. Lowe was found beaten and strangled to death, one of her stockings still wrapped around her neck. Upon further inspection of her body, forensic pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury condemned Lowe's murderer as a savage sexual maniac. Like Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe suffered horrible mutilations. Some of the injuries, it was concluded, to have been sustained while she was still alive. Many of the instruments used in her mutilation, including kitchen knives and a fireplace poker, were left protruding from the body. Her abdomen was also cut open, exposing her internal organs, a grotesque escalation in Cummins' sadistic behavior. Upon further inspection of Lowe's apartment, fingerprints were lifted off a glass candlestick and a half-empty bottle of beer. Investigators determined that due to the nature of Lowe's murder, the same killer of Evelyn Oatley was likely involved. Margaret Florence Lowe was a widow, and following her husband's death, she shut down their family goods business. Then she moved to London in 1934, finding a job as a house cleaner, before sending her daughter to boarding school. Under an alias, she took up prostitution to supplement her income. In this line of work, she met Gordon Cummins on February 11, 1942. The day after Cummins' encounter and subsequent murder of Margaret Florence Lowe, 25-year-old prostitute Catherine Macaulay had her own frightful encounter with a psychopathic airman. Only this time, things turned out differently. Catherine met Cummins in the Regent Park area not far from his station. After some brief conversation, Catherine offered to take the charming young pilot back to her apartment nearby on Southwick Street. They shared a taxi, and upon arriving, Catherine lit her gas stove, got undressed, and gestured for Cummins to join her in bed. Cummins undressed and leapt atop Catherine, driving his knees into her stomach, effectively pinning her to the mattress before he wrapped his hands around her throat. One important detail to mention was Cummins' request that Catherine kept her boots on. Frightened, Catherine was able to maneuver her legs between herself and her crazed client and kicked him in the stomach, freeing herself and knocking Cummins to the floor. Shrieking in terror, Catherine dashed from her room and ran to a neighbor's aid. Cummins dressed and followed after Catherine, approaching the neighbor's door, offering Catherine extra money while apologizing for drinking too much. But Catherine resisted, proclaiming her belief that Cummins was a murderer. In his urgency to leave, the panicking serial killer forgot his Royal Air Force belt at Catherine's apartment, a major clue for authorities as to the killer's identity. On the night of February 12th, the very same evening of Cummins' assault of Catherine McCulley, 32-year-old prostitute Doris Juanet, who would go by Olga, was having a whiskey at a tea room with a friend. Before the two would depart on Oxford Street, less than 2 miles from Southwick Street, where McCulley had just had her terrifying encounter with a violent client, Doris Juanet had told her friend she was off to meet her own client, a regular, whom she nicknamed the Captain. Soon after, Doris met up with Gordon Cummins, fresh off of his failed murder attempt. Given Cummins' inflated ego, it would be safe to assume that the deranged pilot was seething over his recent failure to acquire a new victim in McCulley. Doris agreed to take Cummins back to her apartment. The next evening, Doris's husband, Henry, a former client of hers, returned home. Finding the house too quiet, Henry discovered their bedroom door shut. He tried to open it, calling for his wife, but it was locked. Concerned and unable to force the door open himself, Henry called the police. A single constable, William Payne, was dispatched to the property. Upon prying the door open and stepping inside, he returned to the worried husband and forbid him from entering the room. Payne called the forensics team. Doris Juanet was found, gruesomely murdered and mutilated, suffering from a broken jaw, in addition to lacerations on her breasts, abdomen, thighs, and genitals, in what could be surmised by authorities as a frenzied attack. The knife used was left at the scene beside her. As if despite his previous failed attempt of claiming Catherine McCulley, Gordon Cummins did not spare any savagery in his murder of Doris Juanet. It could easily be imagined that these heinous crimes would take precedent in the headlines, but on the contrary, the massive amount of casualties and developments on the front saturated the newspapers, in which case the terrible murders of innocent women in the dark streets of the city were largely overlooked, at least by those who were not in the killer's sights, such as the prostitutes he hunted, who were abuzz with fear and paranoia, refusing any clients who were not well-known regulars. However, with the murders of Doris Juanet and Margaret Lowe taking place only hours apart, and further connections being made to other victims such as Evelyn Oatley, word of the nocturnal horror show began to make its way to the press, who would soon dub the killer as the Blackout Ripper. The story soon became national news. On the same evening following Doris Juanet's gruesome murder, and with the English press catching on to the terrifying events taking place in London's darkened streets, Gordon Cummins would encounter Margaret Heywood. The two would meet in Piccadilly at a pub, having drinks and sandwiches in the London Trocadero. Afterward, they went on a stroll. At this point, Heywood noted that Cummins became very forward, grabbing at her waist and attempting to force her into a doorway in Piccadilly Circus. He then began attempts at persuading her to go to an air raid shelter with him. Heywood gave Cummins a departing kiss before declining, not wanting to go with him. But Cummins was unfazed and began to grope Heywood, who struck at him and pushed him away. This is when Cummins' behavior turned from unpleasant to violent. He grabbed Heywood by the throat and strangled her unconscious. John Shine, an 18-year-old delivery boy, was walking down Piccadilly Circus on the evening of February 13th, with an order of beer for a nearby pub. As he was en route, he came across a young man in a Royal Air Force uniform, squatting in a doorway over an unconscious woman while he went through her handbag. Upon seeing Shine, the young man fled, leaving behind the injured woman along with an RAF-issued gas mask and haversack. Shine put aside his duties to escort Margaret Heywood to a nearby hospital. However, the two ran into policeman James Skinner, who insisted they accompany him to the police station after they recounted Margaret's assault and the man who fled. The police confiscated the haversack and RAF gas mask, and inside each found a registration number. The number registered to Gordon Cummins. And in a nearby pub frequented by other RAF members, Cummins realized his mistake in leaving behind his belongings. Panicked, he stole another pilot's mask and bag, a poor attempt to cover his tracks. Upon reviewing new evidence in the Blackout Ripper case, now including the registered RAF gas mask and haversack, Detective Sergeant Thomas Shepard immediately contacted the RAF police, who forwarded communications to Cummins Station in Regent Park. Providing the registration number found in the mask and bag, it was quickly determined that the items belonged to Gordon Cummins. By 11:30 p.m. on February 12th, the evening of the assault on Haywood, Cummins Station at Regent Park relayed that he was not in his lodging. With this information about their leading aircraftman, the RAF police issued a warrant for Cummins' arrest and detainment for questioning. And as if despite the horrible circumstances he was weaving for the already anxious wartime populace of London, at 2 a.m. on February 13th, just hours after committing brutal murder, mutilation, and battery on 3 separate victims, Gordon Cummins, the Blackout Ripper, returned to the same area where he just assaulted Margaret Haywood, where just blocks away Doris Chouinay lay dead and butchered in her bed, and where nearby Catherine McCaughey had been terrified by her own attempted murder. All the same, Cummins staggered into Piccadilly Circus, slightly drunk on whiskey, his blue RAF uniform still smattered with Doris Chouinay's blood. And despite all this, Cummins met and got into a taxi with working girl and mother of 2, Doreen Lighton. She took her tipsy, unusually quiet client back to her flat, where instead of paying for her sexual favors, he fell upon her bed, fully clothed, insisting she remain so as well, and began to simply talk. Even though the police and the RAF were actively investigating his whereabouts, and he just murdered 1 woman and assaulted 2 others just hours before, Cummins calmly expressed to Doreen his worry over breaking curfew and losing his prospects of becoming a pilot over his growing offenses against his regiment. After an hour of this, and Doris showing Cummins pictures of her family, the Blackout Ripper thanked her for the cup of tea she gave him, and left her just as he found her. The Abbey Lodge, Cummins' RAF station in Regent Park, was heavily guarded by armed sentries in the wee hours of the morning, February 13th. It was at this time that they stopped and demanded identification from a haggard, sleep-deprived, and blood-spattered Gordon Cummins, who was returning through the front gate. And when Cummins identified himself, the acting guards on duty followed their orders: detain the missing airman on sight. Cummins was led into an interrogation room on base where Corporal Charles Johnson waited to question him. The corporal told the smirking Cummins that he was wanted for questioning in the assault of a woman in Piccadilly Circus, and that his gas mask and haversack were confiscated at the scene. Arrogantly, Cummins acted elated at this information and explained the assault away as a simple misunderstanding. With this, he was escorted back to his sleeping quarters with orders not to leave the premises, as the authorities were on the way for further questioning. However, he was curiously left during this period of time, completely unsupervised. Detectives Charles Bennett and Thomas Shepard arrived at Cummins' residence at 5:45 a.m. that morning, to find him on his bunk casually smoking a cigarette, in the same RAF uniform he'd worn that night. After mentioning Cummins' registered bag and gas mask found at the scene of the crime, Cummins lied to the detectives, stating that he had lost his bag in a pub, and so instead found and took the one he had next to him by his bunk, therefore implying that whoever assaulted the woman in Piccadilly Circus couldn't have been him. Though with plenty of evidence to support their charge, the detectives arrested Gordon Cummins for causing grievous bodily harm to Margaret Haywood. They then cuffed the suspicious RAF pilot and escorted him to the West End Central Police Station. Cummins was then questioned at the station by Detective Inspector Clarence Jeffrey, and whether it was his authoritative presence that finally intimidated Cummins, or the overwhelming evidence against him, including his registered bag and mask at the scene of the crime, the bloodstain still present on his uniform, or the fact that he had Margaret Haywood's phone number written on a slip of paper in his pocket, Cummins finally relented, admitting to the crime, yet remained unbothered about the whole ordeal. Instead, he requested to make a full statement. A drunken mix-up, where memories drowned in alcohol that could not be recovered, was Cummins' only defense to the assault charge. He then agreed to be searched, the police finding £1 notes in his wallet, 3 shillings and 6 pence in his pocket, his RAF identity card, a few personal letters, a silver cigarette case, a broken comb, and in the other gas respirator he had stashed 8 £1 notes and a gold wristwatch. Nothing out of the ordinary to the inquisitive police, but to Cummins these were dark, sentimental trophies for vile accomplishments he had achieved while stalking the streets of London. That afternoon, Cummins was formally charged for the assault of Haywood in the magistrate's court and was to be held at Brixton Prison until his arraignment on March 12, 1942. For Cummins, all this meant was that he'd spend a month in a cell, be released, and likely demoted from his current station in the RAF. But to him, all that really mattered was that he believed he would be getting away with murder. It was then that the bodies of Doris Chouinay and Margaret Lowe would be discovered. and as Cummins whittled away time in his cell, awaiting his minor offense charge and guaranteed release, the evidence was gathering in regards to the sadistic murders that had taken place across the city, and that evidence was increasingly pointing to Gordon Cummins. And the final nails in the coffin to confirm that Gordon Cummins was involved with the murders, his blood-stained clothing and belt were sent to a forensic lab where it was concluded that the blood did not belong to Cummins, but instead was a blood type that matched Doris Jouanet's. In addition, fingerprints were lifted from both items at the crime scenes, and from Cummins himself, as he had never been fingerprinted before, and matches were found on Evelyn Oatley's compact mirror, the can opener used in her murder, and the glass stout bottle Cummins shared with Margaret Lowe. The police now had enough evidence to take Gordon Cummins to trial for murder. Gordon Frederick Cummins, a bloodlusting, sexual sadist who was proven to have killed 4 women, and possibly 2 others, on the streets of London during one of the city's most tumultuous times in history, was tried in court on April 27, 1942. In a bizarre twist, he offered no defense for himself, no plea of insanity, no witnesses to corroborate his story. Instead, he grossly defended his claim of innocence without any evidence to back it up, and continued to put on his unperturbed guise of indifference, seen during the trial smiling and waving to his wife or having casual chats with his attorney. After reviewing evidence and hearing witness testimony, the jury left the courtroom to reach a verdict. They returned within 35 minutes. Gordon Cummins, the Blackout Ripper, was guilty of murder and assault on all counts. Cummins himself responded with no emotion, though his wife, who was present and still held on to his innocence, broke into tears. Cummins maintained his innocence after the judge passed down the death penalty by hanging. Wandsworth Prison was where serial killer Gordon Cummins would spend the next few months on death row. His only visitors would be his wife and parents, who continued attempts at filing appeals for his case, which were struck down in early June 1942. On the day of his execution, Cummins declined a last meal, instead opting for a glass of brandy, of no surprise to anyone who knew him and his fondness of drink, though it would not be unfair to say that the murderous sadist was on that day finally touched by fear over his own mortality, the same sort of fear he seared into his victim's last moments. And at 9 a.m. on June 25, 1942, Gordon Frederick Cummins, the Blackout Ripper, was hanged by the neck until he was dead. And whether by some fortuitous irony, or perhaps even some form of poetic justice, as Cummins was noosed, shackled, and hooded by the executioner, London that morning began a new day to sounds of air raid sirens, while the Blackout Ripper took in his last. A terror unleashed in the streets of London not seen since the days of Jack the Ripper, more than 50 years prior, the Blackout Ripper truly was a real horror in history. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching Horrors in History.